Just want to make sure, are we ready to start?
We're ready to start.
Captioning standing by and starting? Okay.
Sure.
My name is Avri Doria. I'm one of the 4 organizers. I'm not somebody that has a bio, but I just wanted to say a couple words to sort of frame the discussion. We've been hearing a lot about fragmentation. There have been a lot of discussions. Is it happening? Is it not happening? What do you mean by it? And then we've had discussions of woe is us. The internet is fragmenting. In this one, we decided to take a slightly different approach to it. We'll stipulate to the fact that, yes, there is fragmentation as a possibility, and we'll leave it at that and not discuss that any further. But given the internet's ability to heal, to be routed around, to whatever, what we wanted to do was perhaps look at how we can help that happen, how people are already helping to heal these fissures that may be opening, etc. So sometimes that healing requires doing something new, building something, creating something, a program. Sometimes that healing requires just understanding what is going on, why people are building these walls, why they're building these gardens, and how to bridge to them so that they don't remain isolated, but indeed so the internet, which is still constantly becoming by joining other networks together, can continue growing, can continue becoming what it was always meant to be. So this discussion will be focused on healing fragments, what we can do, what's being done. In addition to the folks here who will talk about their programs and their projects, and with our moderator, Robert Pepper, who will help go through the discussion. We would also like to invite the participants who are sitting here, who are also involved in some healing project, in some way of working with the fissures and issues we find, to sort of speak up and give us, the elevator pitch on their project so that we come out of here with as much conversation as we can on what we can do to heal the fragmentation that some see. So thanks, Robert. I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll go to Bill, who will be our first.
Great. Thank you very much. We also have a remote moderator over here. Raise your hand. So when we have somebody online, we get to the questions, just flag me, and we'll go ahead and do that. Thank you, Avri. What we're going to do is go ahead and Bill is going to sort of set the scene a little bit based on some of the work that he did with Wolfgang Kleinwasser and Vint Cerf on the paper almost 2 years ago. And then, as Avri said, we're going to talk about what do we do about the fragmentation, not wring hands and wring our hands or even spend the time debating about fragmentation, but rather talk about the types of fragmentation and what we can do about it and when it's actually appropriate to do something about it. So, Bill, why don't we just go ahead and start with you. Welcome, and go ahead.
Okay. Thanks. I hope everybody can hear me well. Greetings from the land of multilateralism here in Geneva. And thanks for the invitation. I was happy to see that the framing of this session had a little quote from the paper in which we pointed out that we're not arguing that some kind of cataclysm is underway, but rather that we were talking about the accumulation of various kinds of trends that, if left unattended, would reduce to some extent the utility of the internet. That's important, I think, because as Avri kind of indicated, there has been a certain amount of hype and hyperventilation around the topic of fragmentation, which generates headlines and so on. But we, at least, were not trying to argue that there was some imminent collapse or anything else. Indeed, I think fragmentation was always an inevitability at some level. I mean, there was little chance, I would have thought, that the conditions that obtained in the early years of the internet's development, when it was just a research and education network, could continue once the financial stakes increased. Governments started to see that it touches on many different dimensions of their responsibilities and so on. So fragmentation is not a big surprise, I guess. So I was supposed to just do 7 to 10 minutes about sort of the background, the framework of the 3 categories, and then I guess people will deep dive into ways to ameliorate problems within those. So I'll just say by way of starting point, for me, the notion of fragmentation, it is a contested idea. I mean, let's face it, different people view it in different ways. I view it in terms of ways in which the internet's ability to provide, seamless interconnectivity between all willing endpoints becomes limited, usually by some third-party sort of intervention or factor that is not necessarily chosen by the endpoint parties. But I mean, there are other ways of thinking about it. Some people see the internet fragmentation as applying just to the underlying infrastructure and say, well, unless the infrastructure completely breaks and you have, for example, billions of people going off into a different root zone based system that, that there's no such thing as internet fragmentation. So, I mean, let's just acknowledge at the front end, yes, as Aubrey said, it's a contested concept. People talk about it in different ways. When we were thinking about this, so when the WEF asked me to do a sort of landscape study, and I dragged Vint and Wolfgang into it, because there were a lot of people beginning to make comments about, oh my God, fragmentation in different dimensions. And I thought, okay, well, this would be an interesting exercise to try to aggregate the different ways in which people talk about fragmentation and group them into some buckets and see if there's some unifying characteristics to all of this. So, the first question obviously was how broad to throw the fishing net there, and it reminded me in a way of some of the discussions we had about internet governance and the definition of internet governance in 2003 in the WISIS, in the World Summit on Information Society, when there were people who were saying internet governance was just about the infrastructure and the management of names and numbers by ICANN, and then there were others of us who were saying, no, it's a broader phenomena that involves the way the internet is used and the rule systems that apply to the use of the internet for commerce and communication and so on. And ultimately that broader kind of approach, I think, has proven useful. And so I, decided to do sort of the same thing here and to look beyond just the underlying infrastructure. And so in the paper, we talked about sort of adding a 5th layer to the stack, which different academics or people refer to in different ways. We called it a content and transaction layer. You can view it however you want, but this is a way of trying to get at fragmentation in the spaces, cyberspaces of flows that are constructed on the internet. So that led to the 3-part categorization of technical, commercial, and governmental fragmentation, which is not optimal. I mean, there's different ways you could do this. Obviously, when 2 of your categories are based on actors and the third is not, the categories can blur into each other a bit. But it was the easiest way to talk about this, I thought. And then, the core understanding of the phenomena, as I say, for us was the ability of every willing endpoint to communicate with every endpoint that's willing to receive data packets, and for people to be able to, innovate permissionlessly without the approval of some intervening authority. Of course, there's the question of what if people are unwilling to share packets, and of course, people build all kinds of security mechanisms from firewalls to encryption to whatever else all the time. And some people in the WEF community, and Bob was part of these conversations, referred to that as a kind of positive fragmentation. For me, I mean, I felt a little bit uneasy with that formulation, but since people were settling on it, we sort of equivocated and said, one could argue that there is something called positive fragmentation, but I really tend to think more about situations where a third party intervenes between 2 endpoints and basically forces a separation that is not desired in some manner. And hence we put forward working definitions, which we understood to be, just preliminary, and thought that perhaps as people discuss these things further, that there would be some effort to to refine them or throw them out and come up with better definitions, etc. The paper, again, was just a scoping exercise. So in saying that there's technical, commercial, and governmental fragmentation, and that there's lots of different examples that could be grouped under those rubrics, we're of course not saying that all forms of fragmentation are equal, that there's some sort of equivalence among all forms of fragmentation, that the creation of a separate root zone file under control of the Chinese state is equivalent to somebody building a NAT. I mean, obviously it's not. So there's a lot of variation in the forms that fragmentation takes in each of these kind of categories. And you could look at variation in terms of a number of different dimensions, including, you know, what kind of intentionality there is behind it, whether something's the result of unintended, if something's an unintended consequence, etc. And to the extent that some actions are intentional, particularly when you're talking about governments or firms taking steps to control cyberspaces, to bound and fence them in particular ways, one would think that those can indeed be remediated, although not necessarily easily. So in terms of the session's overarching question, I guess, which is, as I understood it, was which of the currently existing forms of fragmentation can be healed, or how can they be healed? You know, I guess my answer would be, in principle, most of them could be healed, certainly the technical ones, through more cooperation among people involved in administering and operating infrastructure, et cetera. But the ones involving commercial and governmental policies, practices, strategies, et cetera, those, of course, can be a little bit more difficult to reverse because there are interests and incentives that lead these actors to behave in the way they are. So that's why and I'll conclude, that's why this year, as a follow-up to that previous paper, I'm doing another white paper for the WEF on data localization and barriers to cross-border data flow, because this is an area in which governments are taking a lot of actions which I think inhibit the ability to use the internet in an open, seamless, interoperable way, which has serious consequences for the internet and the internet economy and the global information society, et cetera. And yet these actions could be remediated if we could get governments to consider new paths, new policies in this area. And the problem has been that much of that discussion has been channeled purely into the international trade policy framework, which is a very non-transparent intergovernmental sort of setting. So what I'm arguing is that we need a multi-stakeholder sort of engagement around these issues. So anyway, I'd be happy to come back to that issue later. But so I think I've done near my 10 minutes. So I will stop there and hand it over to the people who will do the deep diving on the different dimensions. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, that's very helpful in terms of framing, and especially with the paper. So why don't we move to Marco from NCC Right, because you know, that some of the technical questions and routing and you know, how do you think about this in terms of again, remediation? And I think, Bill, from what you were talking about, I mean, one way to think about what you were saying is, you know, if I want end-to-end and something's preventing that because of a third-party intervention, what can I do about that, right? How do I get over that? How do I get beyond that? And so, Marco, why don't you spend a few minutes talking about, from your perspective, in terms of routing and the other things that NCC Right is involved in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Pepper, and everybody. Thanks for the invite. A few kilometers north from Bill, I'm currently sitting in the Netherlands. As Pepper said, my background is technical. I've been building and running networks for quite a few years now, and confronted with the topic, I kind of take a more technical approach. And as Avery said in her sort of introduction, in general, most of the internet protocols, especially at the transport layer, are meant to circumvent fragmentation. They're self-healing. BGP routing is a great example. If a link breaks, BGP will try and find a way around that. Looking at fragmentation as a topic, as it's mostly discussed in internet governance, I came up with sort of similar as Bill with the taxonomy, but more technically rooted, is the internet layered model. And what's particularly interesting there is that, as Bill said, most of the drive on current, that what we say is fragmentation, is focused around data localization, cross-border data flow. But what I often see is that the implementation is usually further down. The implementation is at packet forwarding level. And what happens there is that often you see providers or network operators, by means of higher level requirements, for instance, making sure that data doesn't travel through a particular network or to a particular nation, get limited in their choices and start restricting the network from making certain self-healing choices. And more often than not, actually, when at first implemented, you don't see those consequences. It's only later when disaster strikes and, for instance, a cable breaks, where all of a sudden the self-healing capability of the internet turns out not to be present anymore because of pressures at higher levels. So that's where I think, in terms of the topic, and you look at self-healing, is be aware that the interaction between the layers is important. If you push for data localization, often what I see is that somewhere down the stack, you lose resilience. Going back to taxonomy, and I think I agree with Bill, there's many different dimensions to that. What I still see a lot, especially when you look into the interlinkage, there's a lot of unawareness. From what makes perfect sense from a geopolitical point of view, make sure my data stays within my country, from a technical point of view often has big consequences. And one of the examples there, and I mean, I see it often here in Europe with smaller countries. I'm myself is from that little speck up in Northwest Europe. The moment you start restricting data flows and say like, oh, it can't leave the Netherlands, I'm relying on one major internet exchange. Most of my backup paths would be via other countries. Example in North America is often mentioned is East to West Canada and vice versa, where traffic often flows via the US. And it's important, I think, in terms of self-healing, that people are healing, that people become aware that if you put your foot in the sand and says like, oh, Canadian traffic should stay in Canada, that often from a technical perspective, there are severe limitations. And it could be that from a technical perspective, you later on find yourself shot in the foot as that one remaining cable that you have breaks and the network kind of has a rule set that says, I can't route around the current breakage. So that's a bit of my perspective. Be aware that what you do at one layer, and that's usually at the data content, also could interact with the resilience that mostly exists in the physical and the transport layers underneath. And the general engineering principle, the less rules you have, and engineers often refer to it as the dumb core of the internet, the less restrictions, the less rules, the more easy it is for the network to use that self-healing and be resilient as we know the internet. Happy to come back to that later. I'm going to leave it for now, I think.
Thanks, Marco. So what I'm hearing you say is the internet at the technical layer, if left to the way engineers designed it, is actually self-healing. So at a technical level, fragmentation is less of an issue given the architecture and technology if the networks are actually permitted to be self-healing. And there are some reasons, maybe we'll go to Anupam to talk about some of the things that you see of how this cuts based upon the work that you've done. So one way to, what I'm hearing Marco say is, how do you heal technical fragmentation? Let the internet be the internet. It's basically one of the solutions to that. But Anupam.
Great. Thanks very much, Robert. So as a lawyer, I focus, of course, on governmental issues. And as Bill has pointed out in his fantastic paper, governmental fragmentation is very much a key part of the fragmentation that we're seeing across the world. So what I want to do in terms of focusing on the question of healing internet fragmentation, particularly governmental fragmentation that causes these problems, is to address, is to kind of suggest a typology of how we might approach this healing governmental fragmentation problem. So I want to offer 6 possible types of solutions to governmental fragmentation, beginning from the kind of most inclusive to the least inclusive. In some sense, the most preferred to the least preferred. Okay. So the first would, of course, be some kind of wonderful global agreement, some global agreement that is enforceable, that allows people across the world to bridge the gaps created by national boundaries. The United Nations, of course, has some aspects of this, but not the enforceability part. That is, we have wonderful statements at the UN level, human rights declarations, that really require, if you look at the UN declarations of human rights, they talk about freedom of expression beyond, across frontiers. So essentially, they talk about the ability to bridge national divides. But the one that I want to draw your attention to that may be less familiar to many people is the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has 164 member states currently. Now, when I mention the WTO in an internet governance kind of forum, people tend to recoil. I've already mentioned the UN, people recoil immediately. And then now I've mentioned the WTO. The WTO has a different purpose than many people realize. It's to essentially avoid fragmentation. Its very goal is to promote intercourse between countries. And in fact, with respect to the internet, that is its main purpose. So I think there's some, it's more promising than people recognize, and it becomes then my preferred venue, as you can see from this typology that I'm offering. Second, open agreements. Imagine these as a kind of ISO-style standard that is certified, open for anyone to participate in. That is, a nation state can say, we agree, we adhere to these set of principles, these norms, and we do so in a way that is enforceable. And so that are open to others, to any nation to join in, and not allowing any nation to have a political veto over that nation's joining. So to depoliticize these processes. Now, within the WTO, there is something called the plurilateral agreements that allow countries to agree to certain norms and become and join. Third, mutual recognition. This is an agreement between countries to recognize each other's standards. That is, we won't fragment within these few spaces. And so you see this, currently there's an experiment underway with the US-UK agreement that's being formulated, unfortunately behind closed doors. And so kind of information sharing standards between the United States and United Kingdom that would allow both countries to share information across borders, the content of which is yet to be disclosed. And so the process is highly problematic. So I'm not endorsing the process in any way, but I'm just offering an example of the kind of mutual recognition approach. Fourth is unilateral recognition, where a state says, we won't fragment with respect to these other states that we like. Okay? Think of this as the EU data adequacy regime, which says under Article 25 of the 1995 Data Protection Directive that the European Commission will declare these certain states to be adequate, to have essentially equivalent data protection laws as exist within Europe. Now, the problem, of course, that, why I've put this significantly far down the list is because the unilateral approach tends to be very political. It tends not to focus on actually what's happening, but it tends to be run by the political arm of that country. And so the EU has declared adequate essentially countries, very few countries, and all of them with populations of something like 20 million or less. Okay, so tiny states, essentially. Let me list the states. Canada, which is a little bit more than 20 million, Canada and Argentina. And then states with less than 10 million, Israel, Switzerland, New Zealand, which has more sheep than people. And so, New Zealand, of course, has great privacy laws, et cetera, and no complaint about New Zealand. But you can see that the EU data adequacy approach is very limited. In fact, I suggest that if you want to be declared adequate for getting information from European member states, you are better off applying to join the EU than seeking to be certified as data adequate. The history of the enlargement of the EU is actually much more permissive than the history of the enlargement of the recognition of data adequate states. Fifth, national harmonization. And here I'm talking about things that countries can do to actually change their laws to remove the barriers that they have, that is, to get rid of the fragmentation themselves. And this does happen. It happens sometimes by necessity. So in 1938, Canada had a law that said you can't disclose election results till all the polls have closed across the country. This was in large part because Western provinces voted later than Eastern ones. But of course, in the land of Twitter and blogs, this became entirely unworkable. In 2012, the Canadian government said, we're ending this practice. The Canadian government announced this, the Canadian minister who announced this, did this on Twitter. And so you can see countries that say, our national fragmentation is unnecessary. And finally, what I suggest also that I think is really critical is what I call a kind of national forbearance. That is, our laws may be different in a particular instance. We may have required something different of you coming from abroad. But in this instance, because of the relative interests at stake, we decide not to impose our laws and not to make this particular national obligation on the international web or the international internet. And so I think that is actually a very important approach as well. So those are some possibilities. I think that there's some hope that a kind of patchwork of all of those different approaches might help improve governmental fragmentation. But I think that we should, as much as possible, prefer approaches that are open to everyone, that all member states can participate in despite political needs of any particular country. Thanks.
Thank you. It strikes me that this is very helpful in terms of the taxonomy and the 6 different options, but what strikes me is that this is either a member state or multilateral set of sort of decision processes. So, and that's not multi-stakeholder. So, Deji, I mean, being with civil society, Access Now, I thought maybe that some of the solutions you have may be actually more multi-stakeholder, and then we can tee this up for really good discussion later. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. Thanks for the introduction. The paper is fantastic. I recommend if you have the time to read it. It's challenging, but I certainly learned a lot. So I'm here to talk about intentional disruptions of the internet by governments, but actually the issue cuts across the three different categories outlined in the paper of government, technical, and corporate. At Access Now, we run something called the Keep It On campaign, which currently has 130 organizations from 56 countries, and we're committed to pushing back against intentional disruptions of the internet. The most famous one that you may be aware of was in 2011 when Egypt shut down the internet, but what we've seen is an increase in that occurrence. So last year, we recorded 56 different times. We think that's a very conservative estimate. In fact, it was probably much higher, depending on how you define it. We've seen real harm, so that when governments shut down the internet, we know that violence often accompanies shutdowns. It's basically a violation of free expression at scale. Emergency workers can't do their work, journalists can't report, and human rights defenders aren't able to do their work. We know it has tremendous economic impacts. Two major studies came out last year from the Brookings Institution and from the Global Network Initiative and Deloitte. The Brookings report found that $2.4 billion was lost from the economy between 2015 and 2016. That's, again, a very conservative estimate. The Deloitte study looked at it from a different angle, but still found tremendous impacts on economies. So we know that there are these harms, but we've also had some victories within the coalition. So we have an advocacy arm. So this is when we pressure governments to keep the internet on. If they've turned it off, we try to work with local actors. It helps that we have people in so many countries to pressure them to turn the internet back on. So in Gambia, you may have seen Gambia is a small country in West Africa, basically nestled within Senegal. Not very many people were watching what was happening, but there was an election. The incumbent president expected to just take the results and continue his rule of over 20 years, but made the mistake of shutting down the internet. And we were informally told that our pressure to make that into a story and to get that news out by working with local groups in Gambia helped put international attention on the election. In the end, he was forced to step down. Of course, there were a lot of other things happening. The West African regional bloc threatened to invade the country. But honestly, the story might have escaped without a lot of civil society groups making noise. We also saw this happen in Cameroon for almost 100 days, and the government president decided to turn the internet back on. That wasn't as much of a victory because he reserved the right to do it again, but we're trying to continue and keep up that pressure. There's actually a hearing right now across town being held about the shutdown in Cameroon. But since this is about healing, I'll just talk about we really are looking for solutions. And the way we frame it is we have our advocacy work where we do sort of campaigning, and then we have policy work where we do norm building. In the policy work, we've had some tremendous victories already. The UN Human Rights Council has condemned internet shutdowns unequivocally. 30 governments from the Freedom Online Coalition condemned internet shutdowns and also outlined measures for governments to take steps to prevent them from happening. The Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder body that many of you are aware of, has been speaking out regularly against internet shutdowns and has a great one-pager which you should take a look at. But we also see there's room to grow. We think that more governments should commit openly to not shutting down the internet. There's an election coming in Kenya. We'd like to hear the president say unequivocally that he will not shut down the internet during the election, especially since results will be transmitted via the internet. Election polling results will be transmitted by the internet. We'd like to see licensing for companies to not be so restrictive and allow companies, especially telecommunications companies, to resist shutdown orders or at least document them. And then there's the technical side, which has to do with detection and measurement. There's some excellent groups like RIPE, like UNI, The Open Technology Institute has just done a great study showing the challenges of measuring shutdowns when they happen. You would think that one person understands when the government has shut down the internet and can figure it out. No one has that capability. We just have a lot of hunches. So it means that all the people with the measurement tools need to be talking to each other and try to work together to understand the context. That might be information coming from companies themselves, like Facebook or Google. But even then, we need to understand, through the help of journalists and people on the ground, what's going on when the signal disappears. For example, in Congo-Brazzaville, the civil society groups there reported a disruption, and the government immediately said it was a submarine cable, but it was very suspicious because there were there were some elections coming up and there was some political unrest. And no one ever saw photos of the boat repairing the cable. But then in Somalia, again, a submarine cable was snipped, and the government has openly been pressuring the boat that allegedly cut the cable, to reimburse the government and the economy, businesses for lost revenue. So it's very complicated. Just saying a submarine cable is cut, you don't know. Are you going to send divers down there? It's very difficult. You need all kinds of ways to confirm that. And then I'll just say mitigation. And what we mean by that is when the internet goes down, there are ways to get back online. For example, you can use a virtual private network depending on how the blocking occurs. And I just want to make a note that you can't use one in here, in this building right now. At least I wasn't able to. So I think that's a privacy concern that CSIS should look into. But in other places, we've seen the internet shut down at the gateway level. But the people who ordered the shutdown actually use satellite uplinks to stay online and keep doing their business. So there's a range of challenges. There are some excellent people working on it. We need your help. It's a complex problem, and hopefully some of these solutions that have been presented will help move us in the right direction.
Thank you. Rita, you're working on some community things as well. Turn that one off and put the other one on. Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I'm a plant here because I'm actually going to advocate for some forms of fragmentation. And in aid of that, I wanted to report that I just read a tweet from next door, speaking of fragmentation, that they're asking over there in the Inclusive Internet panel, how could fragmentation help inclusivity? So I want to speak to that a little bit. For context, I work directly with communities in New York City that were really hard hit by Sandy. And in those communities, we're training folks to build and maintain their own mesh networks. And one of the design principles that we bring to this is that should the larger internet fail, which it often does in emergencies, especially in the neighborhoods where we're working, that folks should still be able to communicate locally. And so we are building these networks with gateways, but also with local servers and with the ability to kind of function in an island mode. If you're familiar with microgrids, it's sort of the same principle. So they're resilient and they're local. And in fact, they're hyper-local. These are neighborhood scale networks. And I wanted to just talk about what some of the folks that live in these neighborhoods are experiencing. And this is especially, obviously, since the election. These are largely immigrant communities. There's a lot of public housing residents. These are folks that are vulnerable in multiple ways. And they have experienced real digital harms. Those include things like algorithmic profiling. They've experienced being targeted for predatory loans on the commercial level. They've experienced being targeted by law enforcement. Muslim communities in New York have been surveilled based on their social media participation by law enforcement. Immigrants are targeted now for surveillance via their cell phones, via stingrays. That's happened in Detroit. probably coming to other cities. They're often targeted as well with phishing scams, folks that are not really familiar with the ways that internet works, new users, they're targeted and they don't really know how to respond. So folks are suspicious and nervous about getting online, and you can see why. And I think one of the other things that became really clear in our first panel is that we are often asking folks to take on the onus of protecting themselves digitally themselves. It comes down to the individual. Are you using encryption? Are you using PGP? Folks that are already facing a lot of challenges being asked to also focus on protecting, their digital space. So we started asking, because our communities were asking us that we're working with, these are 5 communities in New York City, what could we do to help communities actually respond to these challenges? And I'll say also, these are folks that, look around. A lot of times it's not clear to them, like, where are these harms and risks coming from? Like, are these corporate actors? Are these governmental actors? It's even understanding the problem is really difficult for folks. I mean, it's difficult for all of us. They see the internet as the locus of fake news. They see what's happening, nationally as being sort of a result of, information ecosystems that are unhealthy and polluted. And so we said, okay, well, these networks have island modes. How could we use these? And we started getting into a conversation with our stakeholders around local data. And that means really thinking about what goes in and what goes out of these community networks, what data is hosted locally, how to create policies with communities around what kind of data they'll allow to leave the community, what kind of data they actually want stored, about user behavior on the networks. And so that's essentially where we are right now, is in a collaborative process with our stakeholders to try to design networks that can satisfy some of these concerns and risks and real harms that people are already facing. So I think, as someone who's advocated for a long time for digital inclusion and getting people online, I think we're at a particularly difficult moment where a lot of the harms, I recognize the difficulty of, suggesting that, perhaps we should police the borders of our communities a little bit more in order to ensure that people are safe from digital harms. It sounds really different from something I would have said a couple of years ago. But I want to say that I think that we're at a point, especially with vulnerable communities, where we really need to do some triage, and where things like policy solutions are going to take a very long time to get to the level of local communities. And where people need to be able to exercise some kind of control over the digital environments that they're entering. I also want to say that these are not walled gardens, although I know people have asked me that. These do have gateways, and so it's more about how and when people get on the global internet, rather than saying, they can't get on the global internet at all. It's about communities making a choice about how that happens. I still think that the internet is an essential utility. These are folks that want to get educated, they want to get jobs, but at the same time, they see ISPs as bad actors a lot of times. I think that's common to all of us. And so we are essentially, using a physical kind of design solution to try to help people exercise that power. And I want to just finally say that, I think that the major 2 drawbacks that I see with this approach, and again, I'll say it's triage. This is not the answer. This is a question that I'm throwing out there about how do we protect especially vulnerable communities, but really all of our communities. But the drawbacks, the 2 big ones I see are, number 1, when we talk about community, and I think Amy Stepanovich raised this in the first panel, to some extent, who makes the rules is a really big question, because right now we're working with, community organizations that helped save lives during Sandy, and they obviously have really good intentions, but I could see, local community garden internets arising in communities that perhaps are not quite such good actors. I could see, the values of certain communities, expressing themselves in a different kind of community garden. And the other one that I'll just mention is censorship, and say that we place a local server with local data at a church. We have churches that participate, and that church decides, well, we don't want people to access certain kinds of content or et cetera. So I think, censorship and what kind of communities' values are expressed in the network, those are two huge questions I have about the work that we're going to try to find our way through as we go.
Great, thanks. I was really glad you added the potential downsides, because the question I was going to ask is, if you go back to Bill's framing, so if I want to go end to end, right, and something prevents that as a third-party intervention, I was going to say, well, this is not a third-party intervention, but then when the downside is actually the community may be the third-party intervention preventing individuals from going anywhere they want. So a question maybe we can come back to is this notion of a community deciding for the individual where they can go versus empowering individuals to make those decisions, and where sort of on that scale does it make sense in terms of people wanting someplace safe and looking at options and places to be safe versus having somebody to decide for them where it's safe for them? I mean, that's actually a really, really important, I think, question. Michaela, I'm not quite sure which perspective you're going to be speaking from. It lists you here as the Department of State, but I know that you're also a fellow up on Capitol Hill. So welcome. I'm really glad that you're here, and that whoever it is lets you speak. So,
thank you. Yes, I'm going rogue today. No, just kidding. So as Pepper mentioned, I am both a senior advisor at the Department of State, and then I'm spending the year on Capitol Hill working with a Senate office. And so I thought that for today's session, I would give some observations from both of those roles, mostly my State Department role in terms of a lot of the negotiations that I've been involved with over the last several years. So I think that in terms of, since this panel is about healing, I think a good place to start is what the U.S. government's approach has been to healing internet fragmentation. And at least from my perspective, what our approach has been to advance the concept of multi-stakeholder as much as possible as a core value and a core norm that we then integrate into across international agreements, in bilateral agreements, at a normative level and a binding level, and use that as kind of the opening salvo for a conversation about some of these broader issues. And so I think that where we get a lot of resistance about the multi-stakeholder approach, I think there is a misalignment between when we talk to governments about their political goals and then what the technology can actually accomplish. And so what I mean by that is really boils down to, just the most basic geopolitics, a balance of power between states, and the more traditional notions. So, for example, governments right now are trying to retain power in an increasingly decentralized world, and the internet has contributed, I would say, disproportionately to how decentralized the world has become. And so as they are trying to navigate their own footing and their own posture in this decentralized world, they're making a lot of choices. And so, and in some cases, they're blaming the technology itself for a lot of public policy challenges that their countries are facing, and they're blaming the internet itself, that if we have terrorism on the internet, it can't be the same kind of terrorism that we're experiencing in the streets. Must be something about the internet that is actually causing it. The same thing can be said about crime, the same thing that can be said about a number of different issues like that. And so when you're starting from that vantage point of governments believing that these public policy challenges can only be solved if you change the technology, I think that that conversation becomes already more difficult because you're starting from two completely different standpoints. And so I think that in terms of the first step is really to try to line up those views and try to at least try to find the same starting point. Another thing that I wanted to add is just some examples about the government's fear of being left behind, I think is another really a driving factor and a driving factor behind a lot of what we're seeing out in the world. So we're seeing governments increasingly taking actions to protect their own private sectors. And they're doing that in international organizations, and they're doing that with local laws and regulations that are, so again, they're trying to favor their own private sector that are increasingly protectionist. And so I think that the best place to really, the best example that I can think of, and from my experience, has been in standards organizations. And I think that standards, although technical standards are supposed to be about interoperability and about making technology work better, and that's why we like to do them in a bottom-up way, and led by technologists rather than governments. We're seeing increasingly governments going into standards development organizations and pushing particular technical specification. And also they're increasingly showing up at and bolstering intergovernmental standards organizations, which is a bit of an oxymoron because in order to be a standards organization, you can't really be intergovernmental, but that's where we are. But by increasingly bolstering some of these organizations and really advancing their views there, it's a way of saying, again, that there's something about the technology that needs to change to address some kind of a political goal. And so I think that for that, and it might also just go back to the comfort zone of these countries, that in order to retain some of the balance that was perhaps lost, for a government to go to a multi-stakeholder body or a multi-stakeholder standards organization, that's much more difficult for them than going to the traditional organizations that they've always gone to when they needed help or when they needed to retain balance. The places like the UN, where it's one country, one vote, the rules are very straightforward, at least to those who participate in them, and they know how that works, and they have advocates within the UN structure itself. Whereas when you show up to a standards body, I don't know how many people have gone to an IETF meeting or an ISO meeting. It's very intimidating to a government official to show up to one of those meetings. You have people just walking up to microphones and talking and kind of ripping at each other's ideas in a very academic way. There's no thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's no proposals that you submit formally. They don't have to, there's no consultation with a group of stakeholders. There's no formal talking points. And that's very intimidating. And also, not to mention, for a government official to go stand behind a internet user with wearing a Aloha shirt and flip-flops is not something that they're particularly comfortable with. And so, again, towards healing, I think that there has to be a bit more give and take than there currently is with respect to how we bridge some of these gaps between the multi-stakeholder forums and the multilateral forums. It's not going to be sufficient, as much as those of us in the United States would like, for governments to completely leave multilateral forums when they're going to have a discussion about the internet, anything related to the internet. But that will not be sufficient. We're going to need to figure out how we bring a more multi-stakeholder flavor into multilateral organizations, and then figure out ways to make governments more comfortable and feel like they are more empowered in multi-stakeholder organizations. And I think to a certain extent, it's going to be it's not going to be an easy thing to do, especially because there's a lot of work to actually be done in both of those kinds of organizations, and this is a time-consuming exercise to get everybody on the same page. But I think that it's one without. We don't want a situation, which arguably we currently have, where these conversations are exclusively happening in silos. And unfortunately, a lot of governments, and in terms of the kind of policies and regulations that they implement, have a lot of ability to hinder innovation and hinder the future of development with very top-down, heavy-handed policies. And so I think that it's an investment that's worth making.
Thank you. So I was just thinking as you were talking about sort of standards as non-tariff trade barrier, right? Talk about WTO. I mean, this is actually something that we saw in a pre-internet world as well. Governments trying to use standards processes to their advantage. Actually, Avri, Marco, and a bunch of the others of us here actually were at the IATF meeting last week in Prague, and it's exactly as you describe it, and I assume a lot of people here have already been there. But that's also governments are not comfortable, government officials not comfortable, usually in places like Internet Governance Forum, or even the Net Mundial meeting in Brazil, where they had to share microphones with people from the technical community, civil society, and the private sector as well. So there's almost a cultural question, right, of bringing people along and educating them that engineers at the IETF don't bite. But likewise, people at the engineers have to understand that lots of government people don't bite either. To actually bridge that gap. I just want to, before we're going to open it up to questions, but I just wanted to go back quickly to maybe Bill and Marco, who sort of teed this up to see whether you had any really, really quick sort of thoughts about what you heard, and if not, that's okay. We'll just move on to questions here in the room and then online. But I did want to go back to both of you since you sort of teed it up. Bill, why don't we start with you?
All right. I don't actually have a burning comment. I'll just say that if I understood Rita correctly, she thought that what she was doing was advocating for fragmentation, if I understood that right. And again, the point I would make is, I don't think that communities making choices together about how they want to interface with the outside world is quite the same thing as having a third party come in, like the government or a major corporation, and basically blocking your ability to communicate with a willing partner outside. So I wouldn't think that's exactly the same thing. But I think Bob raised an interesting question about individuals and community choices that could be probed there. But otherwise, no. I mean, I thought the comments were all very interesting, and I would like to hear from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks. Marco, did you have anything quick? Any quick question, or just should we move on? Or
yeah, no. I think I agree with Bill there in terms of the community networks. Yeah, if there is a collective decision that particular parts of the internet or particular applications should not be accessible, I don't see that as problematic as long as the user is fully aware and the user also has a choice to not engage and find their own internet connectivity there. As Bill said, it becomes problematic when either a third party interferes beyond your control or you're forced to use whatever we would consider fragmented internet. I also briefly want to come back to the comments by our colleague from Access Now regarding monitoring. We do indeed run quite an extensive internet monitoring system and internet measurement framework. What for us always is hard is the attribution. We see things happen. We see countries disappear or networks disappear from the internet, being disconnected or certain applications not working. But as you said, it's always problematic to find the root cause. When you're sort of remote, you see a network disappear. It could be a cable cut. It could be something else. And indeed, we really need then local information from people on the ground or people that are close enough to can say like, yes, indeed, it was a cable cut, or no, our cable is fine, to actually attribute these outages to the root cause, whether it be, let's say malicious intent to fragment the internet or just a plain old accident. That for all means happens continuously. Internet is kind of breaking all the time, and in that sense also fragmentation occurs quite often when cables break. So it's the attribution that's problematic in detecting and measuring it, and for that you need people on the ground or people close to the source that can tell you what happened.
Thanks. Yeah, and then Marco, when you talk about attribution, going back to one of the things that Bill started with, sort of intentionality, that's really hard to attribute. Open up to questions here. Oh, yeah. Rita, please.
It's Greta. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I think call me whatever you want. It's fine. But I just wanted to respond since the question was asked a couple of times. So we aren't in any way preventing anybody from, opening their own account with an ISP and handling things however they wish. What we're talking about is a commons, a local commons, and helping the community, supporting the community in a process of, developing a governance model for that commons, and developing the rules about, how it behaves and what it does. But part of that, again, is because when people take collective action, they have certain power in the market, as well as the ability to take on challenges that face them as a community. So in terms of, asking people to learn how to use PGP or figure out media literacy in the crazy environment that we find ourselves, collective action sometimes can be, more effective than each individual trying to do it for themselves.
Great. And thank you. I want to maybe come back to that. First, I want to see whether there are any questions here. Yeah, there's a mic in the back. The mic will find you, and if you could identify yourself and then ask the question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sajda from the Walt Disney Company. This question is more towards DJ, talking about government shutdowns. So we've seen that repression can sometimes lead to creativity. In 2014, you had Fire Chat in China, which allowed people to communicate without internet. You also have the weekly packet in Cuba where people get information. What other instances have you seen of that sort of creativity rising up as a result of government shutdowns? And has it actually helped mitigate the issue?
Thank you. Yeah, those are great examples. I would say the most common one isn't all that, it's fairly well known, is using virtual private networks and people scrolling the different addresses or graffiti, putting them on graffiti on different walls and changing and updating them as they're blocked. People are very resourceful. I think in Cameroon, unfortunately, we saw what were called digital refugees, where the area that was shut down was the English-speaking regions of Cameroon. One of them was supposed to be the Silicon Valley of Cameroon, called Silicon Mountain. And people were actually traveling across the border into Nigeria. They were actually going to other cities, and people were generously hosting them and letting them sleep on their floor just to get access. So that's not creative, it's just a very unfortunate way of trying to get internet access. I mentioned the satellite uplink that some people are able to access, but you have to be pretty well resourced to access that, and it has to be secret generally, because the ISPs that might be doing it could get in trouble if that becomes known. The network resilience issue that Greta was speaking about, we certainly encourage mesh networking. It's great. What we've found is that for sustainability, if there isn't a use beyond when the government is intentionally disrupted, it's very hard for people to keep the equipment updated, stay knowledgeable about it. We've seen some interesting networks in Brazil and Argentina, and also Spain has some indigenous sort of ISPs that they've been running, and there's some very creative solutions. But if you don't have another use beyond emergency situations, most of it will fall into neglect. And even if people know how to repair it, they need to have an incentive to repair it. So there's an interesting competition happening right now in the U.S. with Mozilla is offering $2 million with the National Science Foundation for the types of solutions that Greta is exploring, but it's only for U.S.-based organizations looking at things like TV white space and different uses of spectrum. So hopefully that will lead to some innovation, but I have my skepticism about mesh networking without another reason to stay involved, and I think Greta's found one and is looking for one in New York City.
Thanks. Mike?
Mike Nelson, I do public policy for Cloudflare, and Deje, I should talk to you because we have some data on shutdowns, and specifically I wrote a blog post with Martin Levy on the Cameroon shutdown and what we saw. But I have a one-word question: Russia. Specifically the laws that Duma passed a couple days ago on censorship.
Do you want to just briefly describe for everybody the law? And put the mic close to yourself.
Yes, there were two laws passed, and according to the Reporters Without Frontiers, this is the death of the free internet in Russia. So it would require that anybody using WhatsApp and some of the other messaging systems be identified by their phone number, and that the providers of those services be able to block individuals who are doing things the government doesn't like. It also, more importantly, would require that search engines and other services be able to block any content that is illegal or not permitted in Russia. So it's a major fragmentation of the internet in about 3 different ways.
Okay, I actually thought you were also going to talk about the data localization requirement.
That's for my panel this afternoon.
I mean, I can respond in a general way that it's very troubling and does represent fragmentation in the ways that you've described. It's part of a continuing trend. A lot of the blocking people and the censorship a lot of people attribute to Putin, but there's a great book called The Red Web, and it's actually been a continuum of censorship. So these sort of forms of blocking have been creeping up over time. They're inherently built into the Russian implementation of the internet and telecommunications and the way information moves in Russia. Different situation that we're observing is very close by in Ukraine. The government has passed a law blocking Russian services, and including two-way communications tools, chat tools, and social media networks in Ukraine. These are not. It's a false. I mean, they're very different situations, and there's reasons, including Crimea and also what Ukrainians perceive to be propaganda, the type that we've seen here in the U.S. has been happening in Ukraine for a long time. And what's really interesting about that situation is that there are some civil society groups who believe that is censorship, but the sort of tide and the political currents we're seeing, it's very hard for them to stop it. So the Supreme Court there upheld the law, and so again, these are false equivalents. Russia's a much larger entity, and it's really troubling what you're describing. It's definitely fragmentation. There's no question about that.
Thanks. Any questions from online? Or nothing? Do Go ahead.
Bob, can I?
Yeah,
can I add
please,
something?
please,
Oh,
jump in.
Okay. Well, just, I mean, it's quite obvious that this is, as indicated, consistent with a broader strategy. I mean, what's, I think, interesting in the cases of both Russia and China is that the kinds of policies we've seen with regard to data localization, censorship, and barriers to data flow, and so on, really are under a sort of larger intellectual and strategic umbrella. They are not sort of random, haphazard, piecemeal kinds of initiatives, but rather are reflective of a kind of a view of the internet as a strategic terrain of struggle in which one wants to maximize one's insulation from possible disruptions abroad and also aggregate as much power as possible. So there's both a defensive and an offensive sort of component to it. When the Russians talk all the time about the national internet segment, that they are, and they're having they're going to build a managed internet and all this, there's really a fundamental conception of the way in which vertically imposed authority associated with sovereignty and the state are juxtaposed against transnational networks, and basically the transnational spaces need to be conformed. And the point is, I guess, at the end, you know, we can say, well, okay, Russia and China, those are special cases. They're two very large countries with a lot of potential influence, and they pioneer techniques for doing some of these things, sometimes on with the support of Western companies, and they prove that these things can be done. And then other countries that may have a less comprehensive approach, a less geostrategic approach, do start to pick up on them piecemeal and say, well, I can implement this, I can try that, etc. So I'm concerned about the influence on other parties that are sort of wavering levels of commitment to democratic rule of law in the way that one might think, the way in which they may be influenced by the examples being demonstrated by Russia and China. Because I think that they're really at the forefront of governmental fragmentation, bigly, as they say in Washington.
Thanks, Bill. So we have a question down here, but about the microphone, and one here. So we'll do these two. But before you take the mic, one of the questions, maybe, I just want to put it out there now, OG. So VPNs, right? So VPN can be used for fragmentation, right? I'm going to just be able to communicate with the people I want on the VPN. On the other hand, when you have governments, VPN is a way to circumvent third-party interventions that prevent you from going anywhere you want. So the question is, VPNs are a double-edged tool, and yet there are now governments, such as in the UAE, that have banned VPNs, period, even for enterprise, although enterprise is still using them in some places, but basically they're prohibiting VPNs. So how do you think about, VPN, how do you think about that? Because, you know, it's a way to prevent, but also to enforce fragmentation.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point in the paper. I mean, if you're working remotely for a company, as the paper describes, you can tunnel in through an encrypted tunnel and start doing your work as if you're physically present. So there's benefits to commerce. I'm a civil society group, so we tend to like them because of the privacy implications. Yeah, we've also seen it in China that there's been a crackdown recently of VPNs that just say big ones that people rely on that actually taking a solid amount of revenue. Sorry, we can't do this anymore. You know, that kind of notice, one blog post and they're gone. And that's really frightening. You know, there are groups like Siphon and other groups that try to have different revenue models that give money to civil society. But yeah, that's really worrying. I think we tend to, even though it does promote this sort of closed environment, especially in the corporate setting that you're describing, that the privacy benefits are really strong. But it's an interesting question that I think the paper raised hadn't really considered too much before.
Thank you. Question here, yeah.
Hi, yes, thank you all for those great presentations. My name is Paloma Munoz. I'm a human rights and business advisor from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And I really have a question geared more towards the corporate side of this. I think we've discussed the government side quite well, but a couple of you have touched on the corporate side of fragmentation, particularly some of the impacts on human rights defenders, journalists, communities at risk, et cetera. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, for me, when I hear healing fragmentation from a human rights-based perspective, I hear accountability and I hear remedy. So on that perspective, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the issue of corporate accountability within this space in particular? And secondly, or related to that, I wanted to touch on some of the solutions possibly. I mean, one of those, of course, is, since 2011 at the United Nations, corporations have been said to be accountable for their human rights impacts through the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights in Business. Now the question is, how do you bring that down to the ground? How do you bring it into businesses? How do you incorporate human rights due diligence, which is the term that it's called, into companies that are involved in these activities? Well, I think one way that's interesting is through public procurement. And I think this relates to somebody mentioned licensing and what to do with licensing. I mean, I think when governments, they're the biggest purchasers, when engaging with these types of companies, including human rights due diligence in those contracts is a key way. I think secondly, adopting national action plans on human rights in business, such as the responsible business conduct that was adopted here in the United States, is a good way to engage in a multi-stakeholder way at the national level on some of these issues. Unfortunately, the NAP in the United States doesn't address this issue. And then finally, on the issue of the United Nations, and going back to an earlier point of the usability or feasibility of things happening there. There is a treaty movement right now happening at the United Nations that's trying to ensure that companies, such as the ones involved in these types of activities, respect human rights through a binding treaty on human rights and business. So that's an interesting space to watch out for. The issue of privacy has made it in, and a few other ICT sector more generally. But yeah, so that's it. Thanks.
Great compound question. No, there's a lot of good stuff. And then, Greta, why don't you start? And then, Bill, Marco, if you want to jump in as well, just let me know. Go ahead, Greta.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to a really great project called Ranking Digital Rights, which it's Rebecca McKinnon, who started Global Voices. And basically, they're ranking the human rights records of technology companies and getting the participation of those companies in order to, put them out there as, being transparent about their human rights records. And so, from my perspective, I'm really interested in the purchasing power of communities. That's one of the things that happens when you consolidate, when you have last mile infrastructure that's community controlled, is that then they can, look for certain kinds of standards for the vendors that they choose. And I think you can, as you started to say, see that there's a possibility for that to happen in franchising as well. So I think it would be really interesting to see, standards emerge around human rights in line with something like the Ranking Digital Rights methodology that would help cities, for example, make choices in their franchise agreements.
Thank you for the question. I think commercial fragmentation is certainly a really important part of this story, and we haven't really touched too much on it. I just wanted to add that from at least from my perspective, companies certainly have a very large role to play in both healing internet fragmentation and also attempting to change behavior. And I think, going back to something that Bill was talking about with respect to Russia and China, it is true that that there are a lot of countries out there that are looking around for ideas. And when data localization laws and different kinds of laws that are very good for governments, a lot of ways that have real IDs on the internet, or that just tighten various kinds of controls, when those are seen to work, they're going to be duplicated elsewhere. And I think that companies are part of that equation. I think that it would be a very powerful message if some of the biggest companies just refused to comply and didn't do business in those places. I think that that's a very big ask, because since those are some of the biggest markets and the financial gains are perhaps too large. But I think that if we don't want to see these same laws replicated in countries like India, throughout Africa, in the Americas, I think that it's something that's worth sort of taking a hard look at, or as a company taking a hard look at. In a lot of ways, companies act like states in this space in a way that's very different than in a lot of other parts of international relations. They often enjoy a seat at the table, especially a lot of the biggest companies, and not just as part of our delegations. And so I think that they can play a role, and I think in many cases they do, but I think that it's not just enough for only governments to be focused on this question, at least holding other governments accountable, at least from the multilateral perspective.
Thanks. We've come up against the clock, so we do have one more question. You had raised your hand, so why don't we do a quick question and then quick response, maybe.
Okay, Thomas Schreins, a fellow at NYU Law, and I'll ask two very quick questions. One is to Anupam, because you raised the WTO as a potential venue to heal internet fragmentation. I was wondering whether you're concerned that healing that might happen there just concerns issues that have some kind of economic value. So the human rights issues that were raised are likely not being addressed at the WTO, and whether that's fine with you or not. And the second quick question is to Michaela, because I think you really raised the crucial question about how to accommodate governments in multi-stakeholder institutions, or how to multi-stakeholderize, if that word exists, multilateral venues. And I think a snarky way of getting to that question would be to ask whether the US would also endorse multi-stakeholderism if US stakeholders were not dominant in internet governance. So looking at it from the perspective of other stakeholders, I think there's a crucial question how to make sure that each stakeholder has an equal stake in these institutions, and I would be interested in your thoughts how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you.
So great question, Thomas. So with respect to the question of whether the WTO is confined only to economic issues and therefore not totally kind of oblivious of and to human rights issues, I think the fact is that if you look at trade in services, what you're really doing is essentially saying a service provider abroad can provide services in my jurisdiction. Go back to the question about Russia. The question is, can we bar foreign providers because we just don't like them, because we can't control them? Well, the trade law gives you a tool to say you can't just bar foreign providers. You've made commitments to liberalize trade. So in other words, it gives you access to foreign platforms. And so trade law becomes, in this sense, a very strong liberalizing tool to help promote global internet flow. So yes, it's written in the language of economics. Yes, that's the reason that these countries came to the table and agreed to these things. But at the same time, it has this power. It's great to hear about the United Nations and the global charters, et cetera, the Global Compact. It's harder to get enforceable obligations in these venues. And so therefore, look, if we could get enforceable obligations at the UN level, I'd be all for it. But you take what you can get. And so if you want to liberalize information across the world, I would suggest that the WTO is a possible venue. Think about the WhatsApp shutdown in China recently, or questions about whether or not WhatsApp is properly available in China. This is a question really about domestic local control, disfavoring a foreign provider of information outside local control, because WhatsApp isn't localizing data, at least currently, at least according to certain reports, et cetera. So if you had a trade framework that were applied in this context, you might be able to say, no, in fact, WhatsApp must be allowed in. So I think there's a lot of room for liberalization in those contexts. Now, just going back to the question earlier quickly, things like in the United States, we have the Alien Tort Statute, which gives you rights complain about companies or entities that are supporting human rights violations overseas. I think those kinds of causes of action are critical to promoting, to making enforceable human rights commitments. So I'm all about enforceable commitments wherever we can find them, and we have to look for them in unexpected places. Thanks.
Thanks. Michaela, you're going to have the last word.
Oh boy, it's a lot of pressure. So I think to the question about multi-stakeholder and multilateral organizations, I think that one important, and how we kind of begin the conversation around bridging the gap, I think that one way that we can do that, or at least begin that conversation, is by so we often talk about internet governance, and I think IGF is a great example as one thing. And internet governance is really, it really is whatever anybody wants it to be in some ways. Anything that touches the internet, anything that has rules around it related to the internet, can kind of fall under this umbrella. And so I think that rather than trying to distill this question and this topic across, internet governance broadly, I think that there are ways that if we start distilling down into specific both public policy or technical challenges that fall under the umbrella of internet governance, and then begin to have a conversation about, okay, which stakeholders do I need to convene, or how do we convene all these right people for these various topics? I think that there are bright spots when you just look at individual issues. So one example that I'll give is, I think in the area of cybersecurity, I actually think that we're making very good progress. And so cybersecurity in itself is a large topic. And so when I use that word, I'm talking about more at the operational level, so at the computer emergency response team level. Right now, over the last, I would say, 5-10 years, there have been and maybe it's because of the way that cybersecurity kind of came up as mainly technologists trying to, make the internet a better place. But that culture has certainly continued to evolve and allowed conversations in this topic, I think, to retain a multi-stakeholder character that other issues haven't quite been able to take. So when there are venues where new computer emergency response teams can come. There are different computer emergency response teams that are both government, private sector, company, and that all can get together and begin and have good information sharing and have good, normative behaviors. And there have even been recent attempts to try to put that at the multilateral level and create, both treaties or a single institution. And all of those attempts failed very quickly because everybody knew about these other things that were going on and respected them and felt that their participation was very meaningful. And so I think that, not that this experience can be extrapolated to every issue, but I think that there's a bright spot in that very difficult area, and that there are likely other ways to do similar things across other topics under the internet governance umbrella.
Thank you. If you could join me in thanking the panel, including Marco and Bill. Thank you. That was great. Thank you all. And thank you, Avri, for teeing it all up.